on. I'll just give people another minute to join the session. So hello and welcome to this session that is part of the New Horizons Festival. And over a fortnight in this festival, we've got over 33 online sessions covering a wide range of themes, from violence against women and girls to digital safety and politics. So I'm Barbara Warnock, and I'm the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the Wien Holocaust Library in London. And I'm delighted to be chairing today's session, which is going to be looking at the lives of Jewish women who journeyed to Britain from various locations, including Berlin, Baghdad, Frankfurt, Cairo, Vienna, Marrakesh, Amsterdam, and Tehran at different times. And I suppose my connection with this subject is that the Wien Holocaust Library has got very extensive collections of documents about the journeys and experiences and lives of Jewish refugees who came to Britain in the 1930s and 40s, and I've done a little bit of research around aspects of that. So really delighted, as I say, to be here today and to be introducing Beya Lechkowicz and Daisy Aboudi. We're going to be hearing from both of them. Just before I introduce them in a bit more detail, just to say this session is being recorded, but your cameras are off. If you have any questions, there will be some time to pose questions at the end, but you can put any questions that you have into the chat function as we go along. So we're going to be looking today at the work of two oral history archives, the AJR Refugee Voices Archive and Sephardi Voices UK. And we have two speakers talking about these important subjects, so I'll just introduce them both just now. So Beya Lechkowicz is a social anthropologist and oral historian and director of two oral history projects, Sephardi Voices UK and the AJR Refugee Voices Archive. She received her PhD from the London School of Economics, and her thesis, The Jewish Community of Salonika, History, Memory and Identity, was published in 2006. Her co-authored book, Emigre Voices, Conversations with Jewish Refugees from Germany and Austria, is coming out shortly. Daisy Aboudi studied ancient history and holds a master's degree from King's College, London. She has been Deputy Director of the Sephardi Voices UK since 2017 and has conducted over 100 oral history interviews over the course of her career. In her spare time, Daisy runs Tales of Jewish Sudan. So I'll hand over now to Beya to start today's talks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for your introduction. And thank you, René Cassin, for organizing the important New Horizons Women's Rights Festival. And of course, for inviting my colleague Daisy and myself today to participate. Our presentations will focus on women's voices in our archives, and we will look at the particular experiences of 6 women artists within the larger context of displacement and migration, pre-World War II and post-World War II. And we decided to focus on artists as their creative outputs illustrate part of their life journeys. Now, share my screen, 1 second. Yeah. I'm particularly pleased today that we will be able to look at the stories of women in both archives, as the immigration of the Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria before World War II and the settlement of a small number of Holocaust survivors post-World War II, and the immigration of Jewish refugees and migrants from the Middle East and North Africa in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s represent the largest number of Jewish migration to the UK. We know that about 70,000 Jews from Germany and Austria came to Britain before World War II, We don't have the exact number of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who came to the UK. We know that Sephardi Mizrahi Jews today make up roughly 6% of the Jewish population in Britain. We don't have exact numbers. While you cannot directly compare the historical context of the 1930s and the Holocaust to the historical context of the Sephardi Mizrahi immigration, you can compare how individuals who've been forced to flee their country make sense of their ruptured past. Both the AJR Refugee Voices and the Sephardi Voices archives are oral history archives. And I think the core importance of any oral history interview is to give us a unique insight of how one person interprets and narrates their own life, lived within the historical and cultural parameters of the time. And hopefully we're going to give you a glimpse of that today. I was very pleased to listen to Margaret Hodge last week as I interviewed her for Sephardi Voices UK, together with her sister and friend a few years ago. She came as a refugee from Egypt, but was born to German Jewish parents who had emigrated from Germany in the 1930s. And there are other people whose experiences span both our archives. For example, Gabriel Josipovici, he survived in France, but grew up in Egypt. We have a woman called Erna Klein from Silesia, who spent the war years in Algeria, and there are other cases. In our presentation today, I will start with the AJR Refugee Voices archive, and we'll focus on the lives of 3 artists who came to the UK from Berlin and Düsseldorf in the 30s. They're called Milan. The 3 women are Milan Kosman, Susan Einzig, and Hannah Würzburger. And Daisy will focus on Sephardi Voices UK and explore the lives of 3 Sephardi Mizrahi artists who came to Britain in the 50s and 60s from Baghdad, Casablanca, and Cairo. Linda Dangour, Bettina Caro, and Lisette Stallo. And I think I can't see who is today, but I think we're joined by Linda and Bettina and possibly Lisette, and hope that you have questions for them later in the discussion. So let me say a little bit about the history of our archives and the methodology we use. I co-founded the AJR Refugee Voices in 2003, following a successful video installation for the Continental Britain's exhibition in 2002. Our mission was to capture the life stories of the refugees and survivors from Nazi Europe who found refuge in the UK. Our first interview took place in January 2003, and in 2008, we finished our 150th interview, and the interviews were deposited with our partner institutions. And one of them, I'm glad to say, is the Wiener Library. We applied an oral history approach with open questions and the notion that the interviewer's role is to help the interviewee to tell his or her story without too many interruptions. The following year, the opportunity came along to create a similar archive for a different group of Jewish refugees, the Sephardi Mizrahi Jews, who came to Britain post-48, following the rise of nationalist movements and expulsions, for example, from Egypt in 1956. We followed the same methodology as in Refugee Voices, and it will be interesting at some point to compare the interviews in detail. But there are differences to the Refugee Voices archive. One of them is that the history of Sephardi Mizrahi Jews is less known. The history of the Jewish community of each country is quite different from each other, and the experience of each community are very varied. Another difference is that the time frame is also much larger. Some of our Iraqi interviewees left in the 50s, some in the 70s, some interviews came to the UK via other countries. The Iranian interviewees, for example, left Iran in the late 70s after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. We also faced a greater reluctance to give testimony, which I think is due to different factors. One of them is that in the Middle East, there's still an ongoing political conflict. Some interviews were worried, for example, the Iranian interviews, that it might have repercussions for relatives in Iran, notions of public and private. It's a more recent immigration. So there are many different factors, and Daisy will tell you more about Sephardi Voices soon. So today we're going to focus on the women in our archives who came as refugees at different ages, with or without their families, who faced many challenges and created new lives and homes in this country. In the introduction to the yearbook of the German and Austrian exile studies dedicated to the theme of exile and gender, Brinson, Borisova, and Hummel discuss they call it the double marginalization of women, firstly by their refugee status and secondly by their gender. They also talk about the twin poles of women experiences, achievement and loss, and the spectrum in between. So today I'd like to pay tribute to the women I've interviewed over the last 18 years and describe some of their experiences in more detail. The wonderful aspect of any oral history archive is that the narratives of the interviewees do not only document their own lives, but also the lives of other women, such as their own mothers. Such as their own mothers. And here on the slide, you can see I'm interviewing Lieselette Kastner, whose mother was scientist Regina Adler-Capella, who invented a very visionary pregnancy test in Vienna, and she was invited to come to the UK. So the interviews illustrate the lives of other people. They talk also about the matrons of refugee hostels, refugee teachers and headmistresses, very important things within refugee life in the UK. For example, Anna Essinger, who founded Bunscourt School, another woman, Dr. Hilde Lyon from Hamburg, she founded Stotely Rough School, another woman, Alma Schindler, another headmistress from Leipzig, who founded the Regent's Park School, and so forth. And the matrons of hostels, people who are really running refugee organizations. The interviews also tell us about the mother of host families and the women who saved their lives. And two women in this respect stand out in my mind in our archive. The testimony by Lily Pohlmann, who was hidden by a German civil servant in the city of Lvov. Her name is Irmgard Wied. And another really interesting story is the story of Rabbi Jacobi, who was saved by the incredible efforts of the Dutch Truus Weissmuller, who managed to get the last group of Kindertransport children on a boat to leave in Holland in May 1940. I don't know, some of you might have seen there's a new film about Truus Weissmuller. It was shown at the Jewish Film Festival. So this is just to say there are so many interesting lives in this archive, in the stories of the interviewees. The AJR Refugee Voices Archive holds 260 interviews in total, of which 139 were interviews with women. And the women were born between 1906 and 1945. The oldest interviewee was born in 1906, Margaret Simmons, and she actually had to leave her son behind in Germany. So they're not only children who came, but they're also women who had to leave their children behind. She was married to a Christian man and couldn't take her child on her journey of immigration. And the youngest woman we interviewed is Eva Clark, who was born on the 29th of April, 1945 in Mauthausen concentration camp, just a few days before liberation. And here on the slide, you can see when they were born and when the women emigrated. So in terms of age, we have 27 women who were born between 1906 and 1920. The largest number of women was born between 1921 and 1930, 70 women. And 42 women were born between 1930 and 1945. So they came to Britain as young children. Around half of the number of women in the archive came from Berlin and Vienna, and most interviewees emigrated to the UK in the late 30s, with the exception of women who survived in concentration camps and hiding or outside Europe, who came to the UK after World War II. This is a substantial number, and I hope in the future we will be able to carry out much more detailed research about their lives. The majority of women we interviewed led private lives, but some are better known, and I've assembled here a few of the better known women. There's the violinist Maria Litka, the pianist Natalia Karp, the founder of Virago Press, Ursula Owen, who was actually born in Britain, but her parents then went back with her as a baby to Germany and then emigrated subsequently. The journalist Hella Pick and Selma van der Perre, here on the left, you can see her, who recently both published their autobiographies. The photographer Dorothy Bohm and Inga Ada, writers Eva Feiges and Inga Joseph, psychotherapist Iska Wittenberg, and a few scientists, Gerda Vrbova, Trudy Stillman, Eve Willman, and a dancer and dance teacher, Stella Mann. So these are the few of the women who might be better known. But I should also say that most women in the Refugee Voices Archive worked at some point in their lives. And I'm just at the process of looking at the statistics. It's complex because people had more than one job. So how to classify women and their work. The experiences of the refugee women are varied and multifaceted, but there are also common threads to the challenges they faced. So in which way did the women's experience differ from the men's experience, and how did the experience impact on their later lives? Coming back to the excellent gender yearbook, let me quote again from the introduction. Prince and Hamel convey a strong sense of the gendered experience of refugee women in terms of their experience of persecution in Germany and Austria, in terms of their active role in the emigration process, in terms of the willingness to support family members by taking on menial and low-paid work, and in terms of their vulnerability as domestic servants and kindertransportees in foster homes. In the Refugee Voices archive, the three areas of experience mainly relevant to women, which are different from the men, are the first one is definitely the employment of refugees as domestic servants. And there are about 30 interviewees who came on domestic service visas. And I should say that was one of the routes which made it possible to emigrate to Britain. Then second, the internment of women in women's camp and family camps on the Isle of Man. And three, the few women who joined the land army. And I've written about this elsewhere. And I think especially the experience of domestic service is still under-researched and underrepresented. Tony Kushner estimates that 20,000 refugees arrived in Britain as domestic servants. And as with domestic employment, women were given entry to the UK. The experiences of the domestic service was often a very difficult one for the young refugee women. And they often lived in unheated and insanitary rooms or sharing rooms with no private space. They struggled to survive on wages below £1 a week, had little free time, and suffered from hunger. And you can please visit, there's much more information on our website, Refugee Voices website, and you can search the interviews by experience. So if you put in domestics, all the 30 women and their stories will come up, and you can look at the stories more closer. It is difficult to summarize so many of the other themes expressed in the narrative of the interviewees. Loss and dispersion of family is certainly very important. Post-war lives and professions, and as mothers, many women did get married, some didn't get married. Often, if they had children, they had 1 or 2 children, the lack of grandparents, but also the building of communities, and more recently, their work as Holocaust educators or their involvement with current refugee issues. Another important theme is talking about the mothers of our interviews, who in the case of camp survivors and children in hiding, often facilitated the survival of the interviewees. And in case of the unaccompanied children, the kindertransportees made the brave decision to send their children away to safety. So now let us take a closer look at the lives of 3 artists in the Refugee Voices archive: Susan Einzig, Milan Kosman, and Hannah Würzburger. Susan and Milan arrived in the UK as teenagers. Hannah came as a young child, and they all received their art education in Britain. Among the 3, Hannah Würzburger is the least known, as she has only exhibited locally, and I'm very pleased that I can talk about her today. I wanted her to join, but she couldn't be on Zoom. Yeah. Einzig Würzburger, they came from Berlin to Britain. They both came on a kindertransport scheme, the scheme which allowed 10,000 unaccompanied children to come into Britain following the November pogrom in 1938. What interests me today is that what did the 3 women artists have in common in terms of the refugee experience, and how did this experience affect their lives, and how they perceive of themselves in terms of their identity. So here's Milan Kosman. She was born Emilie Kosman in Gotha in 1921. And she grew up in Düsseldorf, where she received her early education. She did not know that she was Jewish until she wanted to join the Hitler Youth. When her parents realized that it was becoming difficult to be a Jewish pupil in Germany, they sent her to a boarding school in Geneva in Switzerland. She visited her brother in the UK in the summer of 1938, and then came herself to Britain in 1939 and joined her brother in Sheffield. And her parents came came as well. She managed, the brother helped a visa, that the parents received a visa, and they run a boarding house outside Oxford. She went to Oxford to study at the Slade School of Art, which was at that time also housed in Oxford. In 1947, she started to work for the Radio Times, where she met the writer and broadcaster Hans Keller, and they settled in Hampstead in London. In 1949, she was commissioned to draw members of the German Parliament, and she's best known for drawings and prints of leading cultural figures, dancers, and musicians. And she had more than 30 solo exhibitions. There's one in Düsseldorf at the moment. Yeah, so that's Milan. And here you can see some pictures of her in her room in Düsseldorf. The one in front of the bricks is her in Oxford. And there's a picture of her and Hans Keller in 1947, I think, near Oxford Circus. Now, Susan Einzig was born in 1922 in Berlin. Her father was originally from Hungary, the mother from Poland, and her oldest brother also came to the UK earlier, like in Milan's case. The family lived in Berlin-Dahlem, and here you can see the photo of her house. And she started studying art at the Breuer School of Design. She left Berlin as a 16-year-old on a Kindertransport to join the former neighbors of her parents. After a difficult summer of working as a nanny in Kent, she attended the Central School of Art and Design until it closed during the war. The Foster family and Susan were evacuated to Yorkshire, and she went to Northampton, and then where at the time in Northampton, the London School of Arts was running a course. After she finished, she went to London, where she lived as an artist. She worked for the Ministry of Information and Labour, and she started teaching at the Camberwell School of Arts. Her parents managed to get false papers to escape, but the father was caught by the Germans and sent to Terezin, where he died. The mother got to Switzerland and joined Susan Einzig in London, and it was a difficult reunion, and she later emigrated to Germany, the mother. So Susan Einzig illustrated many books and continued to work as a fine artist. Her most famous illustration is Tom Midnight's Garden by Philippa Peirce, and she won for that cover, she won a prize in 1959. And here you can see that's a photo of her father and her mother and the house in Dahlem. We don't have that many pictures of her in the archive. Now, Hannah Würzburger, who is the youngest of the three, she was born in 1934, and she came on the last Kindertransport from Berlin, which left on the 1st of September 1939. She was allowed to join her aunt, who worked as a domestic in London, but couldn't take care of her, and she was sent to an orphanage, the Shalom House, a Jewish children's home in Hampstead. She wasn't very happy there, and she stayed there for quite a number of years, but eventually managed to move to Stotley Rough Boarding School, which was one of the refugee schools run by refugees. She later enrolled in Farnham School of Art and continued to live in her old school. And after further studies, she went also to the Slade School, and she became an art teacher in Surrey. She married Walter Würzburger from Frankfurt, who was a composer and musician, and she settled in Surbiton. Now, I'd like to show you now, so you got a sort of overview, and I'd like to show you now a video with some extracts where Einzig, Würzburger, and Kosman talk about their identity. So let me hope this works.
Because I mean, you never really, although I was assimilated very well, I think we are very good at that actually. But you're not English. You see, you're not really English. You still the first few years are the significant ones, I think, for the whole life almost, aren't they?
How would you identify yourself today? How do you see yourself?
I don't know. It could be from so many different directions. I don't know.
So do you see yourself as British or?
Yes, I think. Not really. I can't. Again, you're stateless forever, because I mean, I have this loyalty to the to the British, but you don't really. You don't. I don't know where I belong. While they're very good at, I think we are, at stimulating and you know, appreciating the culture and the everything to do with the country that you're in. I still have this very strong affinity feeling with Germany, with Berlin, whether I like it or not.
Oh, I've always liked to think of myself for years and years as a European. I certainly don't feel much affinity with the United States. But the older I get, the more I realize how England has shaped me too, and life as a student in England, and life after the war with Hans in England. Yes, I mean, I think I find it very difficult to diagnose my identity. Is that rare? I think most people find it probably difficult, who have got a sort of two-root system, as I have, in a way. That it was a transition I experienced from one school to another, and then to another, and then to my art school in England. And it's a different situation. The exile only dawns on one in bits and pieces, like when you think of roots in what influences you as a, what has influenced you even as a child in way of painting and drawing and woodcuts, and the milieu you then shaped unconsciously. It created your personality, and then you change with other regions, other countries, other skies.
Perhaps I am a lost soul after all. I don't really belong anywhere, but I feel, to copy Lucian Freud, we're here because we're here because we're here.
Yes.
I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Fair enough.
I think meine Heimat is in my heart and my head.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have no deep sense of belonging. Unlike other people, I don't think I've ever become English. I think that increasingly, the older I've become, my identity depends on being what is so despised. I'm a European, I'm a Jew, I'm a human being. I belong, I have no sense of, of Jewishness.
One second. So I'm just going back to my. Yeah. So exile dawns on you in bits and pieces. I think it's a very powerful statement. And I hope the three excerpts reveal a lot about the experience of the three women and the different ways they try to make sense of their lives. And of course, we need to keep in mind that Würzburger came as a very young child, and Cosman and Einzig came to the UK aged 17 and 16. They represent the experience of child refugees on the older side of the spectrum. The older child refugees soon had to cope with life as adults. They were subject to internment, they were expected to work, and were often not able to finish their schooling. While Cosman and Einzig both managed to go to art school relatively soon after arrival, Würzburger went to the Farnham School of Arts in the early 50s, many years after her arrival. And of course, Würzburger stayed in this orphanage, the Shalom House, with very little support and understanding. She also reports that this aunt she had, who came to see her sometimes, she feels was discriminated, because she was a refugee by the members of the staff. Hannah reports that she felt much better when she went to Stoti Rough because there were other refugees and her parents didn't survive. In contrast, of course, Cosman's parents managed to escape from Germany, and Einzig's mother survived, but they had a difficult reunion. And the mother went back to the UK, and the difficult reunion is not untypical of Kindertransport children where one parent survived. And I think these biographical differences help us to understand how differently Cosman, Würzburger, and Einzig conceive of their identities. When comparing the three interviews, we get a strong feeling of loss and rupture and disconnectedness in Einzig and Würzburger's account. And I think that came across a little bit in the film. And so, account while Cosman talks about her emigration as a transition, as she left Germany early to go to boarding school in Switzerland, while Würzburger says she will always be stateless, struggling to find the right words to describe how she feels, first saying English, then saying not English. And Einzig states she is a lost soul and feels that she doesn't belong anywhere. When listening to the entire interviews, it becomes clear that the outsiderness or otherness, or call it duality, and some also lack of Jewish identity of all the three interviewees is seen as a positive by Cosman, associated with isolation and family breakdown by Einzig, or insecurity and lack of support by Würzburger. And I just want to share this quote with you, where Würzburger links the lack of belonging to the loss of her close family. She says, well, the fact that I didn't have a family, a close family of my own to support me, where you belong. And I didn't. I always sort of was floating a bit, not well grounded, and not, you have to know your heritage, if you like, your inheritance, whatever. And I think that's a great loss. So what's interesting here is that Würzburger and Cosman both married refugees who were involved in the world of music, composer and conductor Walter Würzburger from Frankfurt and musicologist Hans Keller. And Milan Cosman illustrated many of her husband's books. And they lived in the Hampstead emigre community, while Würzburger lived with her husband in South London. So in contrast, Einzig chose a very different path. She became part of the Soho art scene and was close to artists like John Minton, Keith Vaughan, and Lucian Freud. And she consciously chose to become a single mother in the early 50s, which must have taken a lot of courage at the time. In her narrative, not belonging led her to create her own family. And this is how she describes briefly how her daughter was born. And she says, my loneliness I was really excluded from, I didn't belong. And I didn't want to become successful. And I became a bit sort of well known. So I decided to have a baby. I found somewhere to live through someone, had a room where I could have my daughter, and she was born. And I must say, it saved my life. And you can only speculate here what she means by not belonging. But this quote illuminates so powerfully the importance of children for some of our women interviewees in the light of the loss of their own family. Not belonging might also refer to a position in the group of artists she befriended. Apparently, as a woman and illustrator, she was not taken seriously as a fine artist by many of the male artists in her circle. There's not enough time to look at the art of Cosman, Einzig, and Würzburger to find out how their personal journeys are represented in the art, but I would encourage you, certainly on Milan Cosman, there's a wonderful website. On Würzburger less so, and on Einzig, there are bits and pieces you can find. And here I just share with you Cosman's, she was deaf. Cosman was very interested in movement. So here you have the dancing figure, but she was really drawn to early memories of walking on the Rhine and her father on the Rhine. And you can see here a drawing of that. And Würzburger painted this wonderful painting entitled The Mother, which you see on the right, which again, when I asked her, is it like your mother? She said, not unlike my mother. And, she saw her mother last when she was 5 years old. And Einzig illustrated many children's books, which you can see on top. So by having looked at the lives of the three artists, I hope that I illustrated how differently the displacement, emigration, and dispersal and death of family have shaped the lives of the three interviewees. While we should celebrate their achievements, we should also acknowledge the losses they experienced in their lives. In the many interviews we have conducted for Refugee Voices, we find that narratives of resilience, agency, coping, and empowerment stand side by side traces of rupture, trauma, isolation, and lack of agency. In terms of learning lessons for the contemporary refugee situation, I think we understand that it was of utmost importance for the refugees and survivor to be with other refugees and survivor, whether that was in a school, in a hostel, a social club, or political movement or religious association. Now, just to conclude, I interviewed the artist and author Edmund de Waal last week, and he talked about the Japanese art of kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. And this is what he talked about. So kintsugi marks places of loss and fracture. And since talking to Edmund de Waal, this image has not let me go. I think it's a perfect illustration for the complexity of the oral history interviews in both the Refugee Voices archive and in Sephardi Voices UK. We collect stories which contain fractures and losses, but also so many other things. Like the kintsugi artist, it is our job as the keepers of these stories to make these ruptures visible and bring them to a wider audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bea. That was great. So we'll hand over straight now to Daisy for her talk.
Thank you. I'm just going to also share my screen. So my name is Daisy, and like Bea and Barbara said, I'm the Deputy Director of Sephardi Voices UK. Sephardi Voices UK records and documents the testimonies of Jewish people from the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran who now live in the UK. And like Bea said, our mission is to preserve the culture, history, and traditions of communities that no longer exist. Our archive consists of 114 interviews. They are held at the British Library in London and also at the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. And our archive the makeup of our archive broadly reflects the patterns of migration from the regions that we cover. So for example, we've got more interviewees who come from Iraq or Egypt because of the British Empire that was there, over Algeria and Tunisia, which were former French colonies. And so a lot of the Jews who left those countries went to France. Our archive also skews towards the higher educated upper middle classes of Jews within each country, because generally those of lower socioeconomic backgrounds went to Israel because they didn't have the means to migrate to Britain, Europe, or the States. So just to kind of give you a brief background of the region that we're talking about. Jews have lived in the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran since ancient times. We call them Sephardi which is a Hebrew word for Spanish, because the Jews of Spain and Portugal who were expelled during the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century were welcomed by the Ottoman Empire. These Sephardi Jews joined local Jewish communities and put down roots. Jews in the Middle East and North Africa are now sometimes referred to as Mizrahi, which is the Hebrew word for Eastern. And that's kind of a more modern term. We call ourselves Sephardi Voices, using it in a broad, inclusive way. So our archive also includes the testimonies of Jews from the Far East. We have interviewees from India and Myanmar, formerly Burma, when they were living there. And they are members of the Iraqi Baghdadi community who moved to those kind of moved east in the 1800s. And again, although we talk about Mizrahi or Sephardi as one big monolith, actually that doesn't exist. Each country has got its own culture, its own traditions, its own history, its own dialects of Arabic. And within each country, there's also a lot of variation to the Jewish story. So particularly a good example is Iraq, where there was a Holocaust-related pogrom in the 1940s called the Farhud in 1941. And many Jews left from 1950 to 1951 in a very brief period where they were allowed to leave legally, as long as they left everything behind and renounced their citizenship. Whereas those that chose to remain from 1964 onwards experienced very, very repressive laws that, you know, they weren't allowed to own telephones, work, do kind of very, very restrictive laws, and many smuggled themselves out illegally over into Iran. So those are two very different experiences, and interviewees who left Iraq in the 50s have very different experiences and memories of those who left in the late 60s or 70s. So, sorry. Despite these kind of differences, there are some commonalities of experiences. And if you kind of look at the area, it is kind of the Ottoman Empire with a few exceptions. And there are these kind of hangovers from the Ottoman Empire that affect the Jewish communities, especially administrative details that kind of categorize Jews as a separate legal entity within the Ottoman Empire, and then kind of carried on as European empires entered the region. And Jews living under these European empires, primarily British and French, in Libya, Italian as well, they kind of occupied this liminal space between European and local. They weren't perceived as local by the local populations, despite having lived there for thousands of years, and they weren't seen as British colonizers by they weren't one of the British either. So they kind of occupied this in-between space, and that's kind of apparent in the culture, the language. Many of our, I would say most of our interviewees are multilingual, bilingual at a minimum, normally 3 or 4 languages, and the occupations that they held. There's commonality, this idea of kind of a nostalgic, happy childhood that is suddenly kind of cut short, or one event that kind of breaks this happy nostalgia apart. Again, not for everyone, but for many of our interviewees. And this kind of idea of separation is very common. The idea of scattering. People went from having large communal lifestyles to being small family units. And one of the people I'm going to speak about later kind of explores that. And the last thing is issues of identity. As I said, there's kind of this Jews in the area kind of often occupy this kind of in-between space, and the way that they identify and what their identity is a very kind of confusing and conflicted area of the interviews that come up. So the women in our archive, the pictures that you can see, not all of them are of our interviewees, specifically Niran. That is not Niran. That is a family member. So we have a fairly even male-female split. We have 114 interviews. We've got about 58 of those are women. And they kind of cover a huge range of experience, that almost kind of all of the experiences of our interviewees as a whole. You can use women to kind of show that and illustrate that. We have, for example, Jocelyn Shrego, who left Algeria as part of the Pied Noir to France after the Algerian Civil War. Nadia Nathan is a lady who was living in Iraq and managed to go to university in Iraq as a woman in a very brief period of 5-6 years where Jews were allowed to go to university. And we have Rebecca Hakim Dweck, who was born in British mandated Palestine, moved to Lebanon. Her father was kind of still in British mandated Palestine at the time, and kind of was during the Second World War, they couldn't kind of travel. So, and then she moved to the UK. So there's lots of kind of different experiences encompassed. And again, there are kind of patterns, commonalities of the experience that women in our archive have. The most obvious for me, I think, is that they were living under very patriarchal societies. For example, in Iraq, in Sudan, and in many other countries, women weren't allowed to, it wasn't the done thing for women to visit the market. So a man would go to the market, do the shopping, and then the woman would, you know, cook it at home, normally with the help of servants. Unmarried women were often not permitted, unmarried women often weren't permitted to go out unchaperoned, and that was often their fathers that were saying, you know, you shouldn't go out without a chaperone if you weren't married. And all children, but girls especially, were kind of very sheltered from politics and the outside world and real world difficulties. That kind of wasn't their domain, and they shouldn't concern themselves with it. But having said that, when you look at education, all of the women in our archive went to school, you know, until secondary school at least. Many went to university. And when we compare that to their grandmothers, who many of the women tell us that their grandmothers were only semi-literate or illiterate. When you compare that to them, who were all, you know, graduating from secondary school, going to university, you can see there's like a progression in that sense within the region. The one thing that women weren't kind of included in, and girls weren't included in education, was Jewish education. So girls often weren't taught how to read Hebrew. They weren't given a formal Jewish education, and their Jewish backgrounds and lives came from the home rather than from a school where the boys would be sent to learn. And then when we look at marriage as well, there's kind of patterns of common patterns as well. So women of our archive, who are mostly born in the 30s, 40s, were getting married between the ages of around 18 to 24. And they were getting married to men who were 10 years older than that. So their husbands were usually 25 to 35, sometimes even 40. And again, when we compare that to their mothers and their grandmothers, that there's kind of, they get younger and younger each generation as you go down. So their mothers were kind of getting married at, you know, 15 to 18, and their grandmothers sometimes even younger, depending on which country as well. And because of that, it kind of means that the women who we interviewed, just because of the age of the interviewees, actually were living more adult lives in the country of birth, as opposed to the boys and men that we've interviewed. Like on the whole, in a vast generalization, of course, there are exceptions to everyone. But women, because they were getting married younger, they were living these adult lives. They were going to adult social events, they had children, they were running households, whereas often the men were leaving a bit younger to go to university and have got more kind of child or teen experiences of their country of birth. And kind of following on from that is the idea that women were expected to follow their husbands. If they wanted to leave, but their husband wanted to stay, they stayed. If they wanted to go to stay and their husband wanted to go, then they left. And a lot of women in our archive left either their country of birth or the second country that they went to get married. And it's very expected that it was the woman that would leave to get married. The husband would very rarely, you know, join the wife wherever they were. And this idea of sending away is also kind of prevalent with mothers sending their children to boarding school in the West, normally in the UK, because then they joined, for our interviewees, because they joined their children later. But this idea of kind of sending their children away for a better life. Just kind of looking at this generational divide again, if we look at the occupations of the women in our archive, if you compare it to their mothers, again, we don't have numbers for everyone, which is why they don't all tally up to 58 if you're looking very carefully. We don't have all of the detail for all of the parents. But if you compare it to the mothers who were, you know, housewife, if they worked, it was seamstress, secretary, teacher. If you look at the women in our archive, yes, we've got housewife is kind of the largest, secretary, teacher, but we've also got, you know, politicians, activists, scientists, engineers, all sorts as well. And even the people who kind of listed themselves as housewives, when you dug a bit further, they'd often done some sort of work at some point. There was a stigma attached to married women working, and that kind of carried itself over, especially married women of the class of our interviewees generally. And that kind of carried itself across when they came to the UK. So we do have quite a few women who were working when they came to the UK to support their families because they had lost everything, but were hiding that from their husbands. Their husbands didn't know that they were working, and they would hide the income and use it, you know, for food or for clothing for their children. And there's this kind of idea that even though the women were working, even if you were going to pursue an education and a career and your husband was okay with that, the household was your domain as well. So that you couldn't kind of go off and work and you know, leave your husband to deal with the children. That just didn't happen. The last kind of thing is that if you kind of look at the father's occupations, it reflects the kind of status of Jews within the region. A lot of businessmen, accountants, people working in banks. So that kind of is just kind of an interesting aside. I'm now going to go through 3 of our interviewees. Like the Refugee Voices interviewees, they are all artists. And interestingly, actually, we only have 3 artist interviewees, and all of them are women. So you can make of that what you wish. And I'm going to go through them in a very arbitrary order of the year that they left their country of birth. So I'm going to start with the person who left first and end up with the person who left last. So, sorry, I've been a bit throaty today. So the first person is Lisette Stalbo. She was born in Egypt in 1947, and she was born in Cairo. Her parents were both born in Turkey, and while her mother held a diplomatic British passport, her father, who Lisette describes in her interview as a bohemian, chose to remain a stateless resident of Egypt. In fact, nearly 50% of Egypt's Jews were stateless, although in most cases this wasn't by choice. Lisette grew up in a very secular household with family friends of all religions and nationalities. In Egypt, she spoke Arabic, French, and Ladino, which was just 3 languages of the 9 that both her parents spoke, including Esperanto. Her parents were Esperantists. Lisette was too young to remember the coup d'etat in 1952 that led to the removal of the Egyptian monarchy and establishment of the Republic of Egypt. In 1956, General Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, leading to the Suez Crisis. Lisette was 9, and all British and French nationals, amongst them thousands of Jews, were declared enemies of the state. Due to Lisette's mother having her diplomatic passport, she and the children were given 2 days to leave. Like many other stateless Jews in Egypt, Lisette's father was detained without charge. Lisette describes getting on a boat heaving with refugees and leaving Egypt. On arrival to the UK, Lisette, together with her mother and siblings, were taken to a refugee camp. Egyptian Jews arriving in the UK at this time were placed in camps all over the country, and Lisette found herself in Kidderminster in disused army barracks. And we actually have quite a lot of interviewees who were also in Kidderminster at the time, although it doesn't seem like they found each other. The family were taken in by a local Jewish couple who themselves were Holocaust survivors. After 6 months, Lisette's father was released and joined the family in England, where they moved to rented accommodation in Birmingham. Lisette inherited her love of art from her father, who was an amateur art restorer to the elite in Egypt. She moved to London aged 18 and built a fashion business. And after falling ill with ME in the early 90s, Lisette began to pursue art more seriously, graduating with a master's degree in fine art from St. Martin's. She went on to exhibit and retrained as an art psychotherapist, saying, "Art was my subconscious way of exercising the trauma of becoming a refugee." Linda Dangour was born in 1949, so 2 years after Lisette, in Baghdad, Iraq, into an eminent Iraqi Jewish family. Her great-grandfather, Ezra Dangour, was chief rabbi of Baghdad. In her interview, Linda spoke of strong memories of smells, tastes, and colors of her early childhood in Baghdad, where she grew up speaking both French and Arabic. The Iraq Linda grew up in had already lost many of its Jews. Between 1950 and 1951, as I said, 110,000 Jews left Iraq. They were airlifted to Israel on the condition that they forfeit their Iraqi citizenship and left all their property to the state. Linda was around 10 years old in 1958 when a coup d'etat led to the abolishment of the monarchy and Iraq was declared a republic. And these are the kind of brief years where Jews were given some more rights. In her interview, she describes how memories of this violent coup affected her deeply. In the summer of 1959, Linda and her brothers and her parents left Iraq. The plan was to go to Lebanon on holiday, which was the first time Linda had been abroad. Once in Beirut, Linda was told they were going to remain in the country and she started attending primary school. She lived near her cousins, and it was here that she experienced overt personal anti-Semitism for the first time. The family lived in Lebanon for the next 2 years, over which time her father made regular business trips back to Iraq. In 1961, so 2 years later, Linda and her immediate family moved to London, where she attended the French Lycée. She describes this move as the first time that her family changed from a tribe to a unit. Within a few months of arriving in the UK, the family were made stateless and received laissez-passer documents from refugees with refugee status from the UN. Linda studied fine art and in 1981 moved to Paris, where she established a successful business as a graphic designer. In 1994, she returned to London when, she says, she discovered clay. She began exhibiting her pottery, which often reflects her interest in layers of life, nature, and history. And in 2011, Linda published a cookery book capturing the tastes of her childhood, named Flavors of Babylon, to critical acclaim. And the last interviewee is Bettina Caro. Bettina was born in Casablanca in 1955, but she grew up in Tangier, where her family moved when she was just 1. She's a proud descendant of Rabbi Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of Jewish law, in 1556. At home, Bettina grew up speaking both French and Spanish. Her father was a keen amateur artist and used to paint at home, and he encouraged Bettina to join him when she was just a toddler. The family lived in an affluent part of town, and in her interview, Bettina spoke of fond memories of Tangier. The extended family would often get together to celebrate Shabbat, the Sabbath, and other Jewish festivals. The Morocco Bettina grew up in, like Linda's Iraq, had already lost many of its Jews. Following anti-Semitic riots in 1948, high levels of emigration to Israel occurred. And by 1956, just a year after Bettina was born, 100,000 Jews had left Morocco. Despite this, Bettina remembers an active Jewish community and a large number of synagogues in Tangier. In 1956, Morocco gained independence and 5 Jews were appointed to government. Bettina's father became a councillor in the Chamber of Commerce. When the Six-Day War broke out in 1967, Moroccan Jews experienced a sharp rise in anti-Semitism. But Bettina in her interview was very clear that she personally didn't experience that. She did remember, though, having to be very careful when speaking about Israel and about her Judaism, and didn't wear any outward signs of her Judaism. By 1973, there were only a few thousand Jews left in Morocco. This meant a loss of business for Bettina's father, and the family left Tangiers for Madrid. There, Bettina and her family would spend weekends visiting art galleries, museums, and exhibitions. She began painting with her father again, who taught her many of the techniques she still uses today, and she held her first exhibit in Madrid. In 1980, in Spain, Bettina met her British husband, and a year later moved to London with him. She has established a successful career as an artist, drawing heavily on her Sephardi heritage for inspiration. I'm going to show you now a short film like Bears, where our three artists speak about their feelings of identity.
I wrote this poem when I was actually taking a master's in art psychotherapy, and for the final we had to do a self-portrait in any art form we wanted. Once upon a time there was a little girl whose whole world was shaken when she was 9, or was it 6? Like a caterpillar in a cocoon, she got moved too soon to become a natural butterfly. To survive, she would need to adapt, to learn, to stay vigilant at all times, lest it should happen again. And it could, you know. So there she was, knowing only who she was by relation to another. Thrown out, expelled, kicked out, some said, for being British. What was British? What was she? A comedy or a tragedy? What a mistake of nature she must be. A hybrid for eternity. So little by little, she tried to reform her identity. For obviously, England was where she was meant to be. And anyway, they wouldn't have her back, you see. My children were born here. So an Egyptian became a mummy, but not in the British Museum, you see, only in her identity. Confused yet? Wait and see, you'll never be as confused as me. How can an identity be a passport, a piece of paper? How is an identity formed? For me, it was my family, since it could never be my territory, which shifted like the sands in the land where I was born. Nothing is black and white, you see. Yes, I am my family, but it is no longer a comedy or a tragedy to also be me. And yes, I am of them, and I am also a separate identity, a hybrid. That is my personality. But my soul is whole. My soul dances amongst the embers of my identity and says, all the rest is history.
So when I went to France, the French are much more direct than the English. They would say, where do you come from? Looking at you like this. And, oh no, what are you? And I'd say, I'm English, you know, je suis anglaise. Oh, no. No, they say. But they would say something terrible like, have you seen your face? How can you be English? You know, really direct. So then I started, because I'd forgotten that I was Iraqi, I sort of became English, you know, went to art school, had English friends. You don't think, you're integrated, you don't think too much of the past. So I had to start to say, originally I'm from Iraq. And so my Iraqi identity started to become much more important while I was in France. Mm-hmm. It's really an interesting thing to do with identity, you know.
Well, it's how others see you in a different situation.
Yeah.
How would you describe yourself today in terms of your own identity or layers of identity?
I would say that I would like to say that I've become a person, what would I say? I would say I'm Iraqi. But with a Mediterranean flair. I would say I'm Iraqi with a, yeah. But very much part of the East, an Eastern person. And I would regard even southern Spain as Eastern, even though it's in the West. So, yeah, with a Mediterranean flair, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I left Tangiers in '73, and then I went in the late '80s with both my girls, who were young at the time. But it wasn't the Morocco I knew. So I didn't want to go back. I never wanted to go back to Morocco after that. And I said, no, I prefer to have this image, but it is in me and I love my roots. So, and I want to celebrate my roots. So that's why I'm happy doing a couscous or painting different scenes of my Morocco, my childhood in Morocco. I would say I am English Sephardi. I am English because yes, I've been English. I've been living here for 30 years, which is the most time I spent in the country. You see, more than Morocco and Spain. And Sephardi because of my culture. Yes, of my culture, my traditions. Yeah, the fact that I move from country to country can only enrich you. You learn from other cultures. Of course, you take the good and the bad, but there's a lot. Certainly, for me, I try to take the good of most of the places I lived.
So again, you can see a huge variety, but also this common thread of kind of Sephardi or Jewish or Eastern that kind of runs through all of our interviews. Really, that's kind of a constant for most of our interviewees. Again, or not all. That's kind of the constant caveat. What is quite interesting is that there is a greater tendency for women to speak about their reactions to events, speak about their emotions regarding events in their lives, and to analyze. To self-analyze in their interviews, which men tend not to do as much. And that's very clear in the three examples that you've seen, I think. And they're all kind of very, very self-aware and very aware of how their experiences, whether positive or negative, have affected them and influenced their art. So despite all of this, there's so much more that probably can be said about women in our archive, but I'm going to stop now. And I hope that I've kind of shared a bit of the flavour of the Sephardi Voices archive and the women in them. And I think we're happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Daisy and Bea before that. Yes, so as Mia's saying, any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and I can field them and put them to our speakers. There were two such rich presentations and I thought it was just very interesting to have the sort of, in a sense, the two different sets of stories with different historical contexts, but hearing them together in one event and through, in a sense, it's similar projects. I just found that really fascinating. So, I mean, I suppose I've got a few questions. So just while we perhaps wait for people to have a think, perhaps you could comment on what the future of the two projects is. Perhaps Bea, then Daisy. It'd be interesting to sort of hear what future plans you've got, where the research and the projects are going.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Well, obviously now, we have collected so many interviews now. So of course we would like to share the content. And one of the big problems with any oral history archive is that they're long interviews, really long interviews. Maybe Refugee Voice is slightly longer than Sephardi Voice, but they're long interviews. So the question is, how do you share it? So we have, we share through social media. we make short films, but really our aim is to share more. The Refugee Voices, is part of a big organization, Association of Jewish Refugees. So in a way, we have a platform. It's easier. For Sephardi Voices, it's a bigger struggle. We are a small independent charity looking for support. So we have plans, to publications and books and exhibitions, but it's funding dependent. But I should also say we support researchers. We have lots of people coming to us wanting to see the interviews. So hopefully, it can be used by all kinds of PhD students, MA students. Yeah.
Thank you, Daisy.
Well, I think Bea's kind of covered it as well. We're kind of looking to move into education. I think it's maybe even over lockdown, maybe the last year, since the Board of Deputies of British Jews published a commission saying that we kind of need to address they said lots of things about racism within the Jewish community, but one of the things that came out was that we need to kind of look more at Sephardi Mizrahi heritage and kind of include that more in the British Jewish experience. And I think, yeah, we have this huge archive. People don't really kind of maybe think about it as part of the British Jewish experience, which is actually, when you think about it, a bit mad, because many of these people have been here for 50, 60 years, 70 years in some cases now. So yeah, I think for us, a priority is kind of to use our archive for education, to kind of broaden that conversation about the British Jewish experience and who we are as British Jews.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, no, I think that the sort of Sephardi Mizrahi stories aren't that well known really in Britain, so that definitely be important. I've sort of got a question. It relates to also Mia's question, and Mia's asking whether you've brought these two groups of women together to reflect on their stories. And I suppose I just wondered about, I think the presentation showed there are some points of similarities, but how much there's been kind of active reflection on similarities and differences between the two archives and the two sets of stories.
Yeah, I could just say something. I think it's a really interesting question. And it's a great idea. Of course, we mustn't forget that, for Refugee Voices, we started interviewing in 2003. So a lot of our women are not alive anymore, and they were, older when we started. So out of the 3 artists, only 1 is still alive. But I think it's a really interesting idea to create something.
I think, it's something that we talk about a lot, because obviously we work together. It's something that we spend a lot of time kind of chatting about. But this has been the first, well, we did one event with Gabriel Giuseppevicci together, because his experience covers both archives, but this is kind of the first event that we've drawn these direct comparisons. And I think it was really interesting to be able to do that. And it's something that I think we'd like to do a lot more of formally.
I think there would be interest among our interviewees to do that, so yeah. I mean, listening to Daisy, I mean, it is really interesting to compare the narratives, and for me, like, one of the striking differences is, of course, it's the change of families. So for the Sephardi Mizrahi story, it's from a huge family to a small nuclear family, and for the Refugee Voices is from smaller families to either no family or, so it's a different trajectory. But some of the struggles, and listening to these struggles of duality, identity, I mean, it is amazing, the similarities you can find. And after all, we all have to make sense of our lives. And that's the wonderful thing with the oral history, that we can be witnesses to how somebody makes sense of their life.
Yes, and I wonder if, on a sort of related theme, if perhaps you could both comment on Caroline's comment about, she's mentioned how it's interesting to see how countries of birth seem to have influenced artistic style. So I don't know if either of you had any comments about whether the artistic traditions of where people kind of started their journeys and originated from have an influence on how their artworks emerge?
I think, should I go first? So I think for some, we're not art experts, and I don't want to we can only go by what the artists have told us. I think for Bettina, especially from Morocco, her art is very, she kind of has made a conscious decision that she wants to paint with Moroccan themes, and she uses her, techniques that her Moroccan father taught her. So it's very evident in her work. For Lisette, a lot of her work focuses on this issue of identity. She does a lot of installations and exhibitions and sculptures, and there's a common theme of identity. She did one that I didn't show on homelessness with the theme of what if. So there's this idea of refugee and making sense of her identity through her art. And I think Linda kind of is almost in the middle in that she uses, her pottery is reminiscent of the pots that she used in Baghdad, and is kind of influenced through that. In her interview, she says that she wasn't doing it consciously, but she realized afterwards that her pots were kind of reflecting the patterns and the shapes of pots that she was using in Baghdad. And her art kind of reflects, like the prayer artwork. So it's kind of in the middle is that kind of, she's using her background, but maybe not as consciously as Lisette is. And yeah, but that's me just taking what I take from the interviews. They're not here obviously to answer themselves, and I'm sure they'd be able to give much better answers than me.
Well, I think it's really interesting, Daisy. And I think when I see Linda, I don't know whether Linda is here with us.
No, she's not here.
The layers of her pots, I think it's wonderful. It's like this kitsuki, because you have the layers of identity and the layers, and sometimes she has the little white stones within those layers. So it's very expressive. But to come back to the question, I think it's very complex to answer the question. Again, I'm not qualified, but I mean, Milan, for example, who's the most prolific, has had lots of exhibitions. She certainly started drawing in Germany, and she was influenced, and it's a very, very long interview of I think 6 or 7 hours. So where she talks about her influences, and certainly, the themes, the whole thing of movement, she was really interested in movement, things not standing still. You can say that's linked to migration of some sort, but Susan Einzig, another aspect, of course, is what we have to remember, the women needed to support themselves. So both Susan Einzig and Milan Kosman, they worked for the Radio Times and did illustrations on programs, and it was their job. So that was another important aspect. For Hannah Würzburger, I can't. She was a child. In which way she is influenced or not, it's a difficult thing, and I'm not familiar enough with the work. But I'm sure for all of them, it played a role. For Milan, for sure.
Thank you very much, Bea. I don't know if any questions have come in directly to either of you two. No. I'm going to hand over to Mia, because I'm not quite sure what she thinks of what Penina's saying, and also because I think Mia maybe wants to kind of say a few words about the festival. But it's been 2 really fascinating presentations. It's been so interesting for me to kind of hear these stories kind of in juxtaposition. And thank you for those who have posed questions. But yes, I'll hand over now to Mia.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Daisy and Bea, for really fascinating presentations. There's a lot there, and actually, as Renee Cassan, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights, where we work to promote human rights and human stories, drawing on our Jewish values and our Jewish heritage. Our heritage is very rich, and we very much learned through these stories, if not today, and not just today, but through previous research, the wealth of knowledge and references that we can draw on from both you know, the more European stories, but also the Mizrahi and Sephardi stories. And through the lens of women, I think adds even a more unique dimension. Like you said, Daisy, there's a lot that you can learn about the wider community or the wider family, looking at it through the lens of the women. Like I said, Renee Kassan works to promote and protect human rights. Women's rights is at the core of it. I would argue that every right that women, or every violation of rights women experience, and probably even more, and some of it we heard from the stories now, but women are also strength and a source of you know, the family, the historical narratives, the future, and that's why at Renee Kassan we've taken this on. We're at the final day of our New Horizons Women's Rights Festival, so it's been a pleasure to have both Bea and Daisy, and brilliantly chaired by you, Barbara, so thank you very much. Penina, because of the platform we're using, there's no way of voicing your questions. So if you have a quick question you still want to ask either Bea or Daisy, then please do write that on the Q&A. Otherwise, oh, yes, there is one very quickly.
I would also like to add something, yeah, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead, Bea.
Yeah, while we're waiting for the question. No, I think what is very important, that goes also with the mission of Renee Kassan, is really about listening to stories and histories being acknowledged. And to me, you know, thinking of those two archives, it is really acknowledging histories, and that's important for the interviewees as well, you know, and that's so important. And thinking of Sephardi Mizrahi stories, where we speak to second, third generation, saying, you know, we grew up, we didn't hear these stories. So that's what's important, and I think goes across maybe all oral history interviews, you know, but, you know, and Renee Kassan is doing the same thing in terms of human rights, in terms of, you know, acknowledging people's stories.
Thank you, Bea. Let's all remember at the core of the phrase human rights is the word human. So if it's not for us and the human stories that we have to tell from the past or the present, then there's no way we can affect the future and create a better future and a change.
And I just, sorry, Linda's just arrived, Linda Dangor. Maybe we could put Caroline's question to her, and she can type us a reply. It's Linda, the question was that how does the country of birth influence your artistic style? I don't know, it's Linda Dangor, if she's able to answer that. She's just arrived. Sorry to interrupt you, Mia.
No, that's fine. I'm going to give Linda the opportunity to speak.
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, it's very difficult for an artist or a maker to be objective about one's work. So it's almost like when I want to analyze the question and try to answer it, it might not be exactly that, because it's so difficult to be objective. On the other hand, I think the land, the desert, the arid land was something that must have influenced my work in the sculptural sense, when I use clay. And I always like very parched landscapes. And I think some of my work shows maybe that kind of geological strata. Some of my work shows that. But also, because I paint as well, so I used to draw a lot of calligraphy in Arabic when I was young, and I think the written word has always been something very important to me. And so in my paintings, there's always a corner or a horizon that has some kind of text. So I think text and arid landscapes are the two, probably the two elements that are in my work. There might be more, but it's difficult for me to say, to be so objective, but I think these two elements are very obvious to me.
Linda, can I ask you something? Because one of the questions here which came up, how would you feel about art being used for educational purpose to tell the story by Carolyn Sifkin, I think, which is really interesting, which we haven't done yet, but is an interesting aspect. How would you feel about that?
You mean taking a piece of work and from that standpoint, from that particular focus, it goes out a little bit into a story about the history, let's say, of a person or of a people.
Yeah, or tell the refugee story, the Sephardi Mizrahi refugee story. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think it's a very good idea, but it's something that has to be really thought about properly. But yes, I think, and also I think something visual is always much more poignant than just talking. At the moment, people like visual things. So if you, instead of showing photographs, if you show a piece of work that is a little bit, how can I say, mysterious, it might wake them up and listen more. But yeah, sure. I mean, Bettina's work also is you could do a focal point on Morocco. Yeah, I think I could do that. I think I could do that because I did a talk at the Oxford synagogue, and it was a little bit like that, where I presented the work, but then I said the story and I said the influences, and so it's I think it's a good idea.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely that you were able to join us.
Yes, I was cooking because I've got people coming tonight, and so I suddenly thought, oh my God, I forgot.
It's lovely, and I'm glad you were able to share some of your thoughts. I'd like to thank everyone again. I'm very conscious of time, for joining us this midday. Again, thank you, Daisy and Bea and Barbara and everyone who listened and joined. Linda, and I look forward to seeing you. We have our final event this evening where we celebrate Uyghur culture with Jewish friendship. So again, around the stories of what culture, food, like art, means to us as individuals, and our narratives and our stories. So I would encourage all of you to sign up and join us. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Will it be recorded?